Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Welcome back to Butler on Business. My name is Jason Riddle. I'm here with Alan Butler. Joined now with us on the phone is David Graeber. He's the author of the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And in this book, Mr. Graeber, he examines the historical significance of debt. So these debt problems that we're facing on a global scale today are really no different than a lot of things that we've already seen throughout history.
David, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Well, it's good to have you. Well, tell us, you mentioned in the book, as Jason just alluded to, the fact that we've seen these debt crises before. Could you share a couple of them with us?
Well, it's pretty much perennial throughout human history. The very first records we have, economic records, go back maybe to 3000 BC, and there's already periodic debt crises then. This coincides with the invention of lending money at interest, which seems to emerge right around the same time as writing, actually. And society was periodically racked by these terrible debt crises whereby it seemed like everything was going to fall apart. A tiny percentage of the population became creditors and started taking away everybody's possessions, block steals, reducing people to slavery effectively, sometimes literally, taking away members of people's families. So throughout human history, almost invariably there had to be some mechanism to sort of head this off before society broke down entirely. Usually in the ancient Middle East, they just canceled the debts. Every new king that would come in would say, okay, clean slate, all debts canceled except maybe for commercial debts, and they'd start again.
Our problems here in current times, I think a lot of them can be traced back to the central bank, the system that we have right now running our monetary system. In your book, you talk about the origins of central banks. Can you explain that to our listeners? Where did this creature come from?
That's very interesting, yes, because it represents this kind of marriage between financial classes and war. People don't realize how closely these things have always been related. The second central bank really, but the first really effective model was created in 1694, the Bank of England. And what basically happened was a bunch of London merchants got together and made a loan of £1.2 million to King William, who was pursuing a war in France. It's always war debt. And the king then gave them a monopoly over the right to issue paper money. But what this paper money was actually the money, the £1.2 million, that the king now owed to the bankers. They got to lend to other people. That's what pounds still are, actually. If you look at a pound, it has a picture of the Queen, and it says, I promise to pay the sum of £10. It's a promissory note. It's a government debt. And ever since, this is kind of the secret of modern monetary economics. What most money is circulating government debt, and very often that's war debt.
So explain that in terms of our current system here in the United States. A lot of people, I think if you went to the street and asked them what is a dollar, what is it backed by, they might say gold or silver. I don't think that they realize that our dollars are actually the same situation here, circulating
exactly
U.S. debt.
Same. Yeah, this pound was backed up by gold ultimately for much of its history, and the dollar was, at least externally, until 1971. Gold was redeemable for gold at a rate of $35 an ounce for much of the 20th century until Nixon canceled it. It's an interesting story in itself because during the Vietnam War, more and more dollars were floating overseas, and France finally decided to call it back. They basically called his bluff. They said, all right, we want our gold. And at the first, they just sort of shifted it around. They have these vaults under the Federal Reserve saying, okay, we'll move it from the American room to the French room. But it didn't actually change. Finally, they sent a battleship to New York Harbor. It said, come on, give us the gold. And Nixon said, all right, never mind. We're off the gold standard. So they never got the gold. But ever since then, the system we have is one whereby the Federal Reserve basically creates money. And it lends that money to the government and then circulates the debt. The irony is that most people don't realize where the Federal Reserve gets the money, which is they just make it up. They can wave a magic wand and lend it to the government. Federal debt is actually owed to the Federal Reserve, and it's just money they made up.
David, let me say this. Okay. First of all, I want to throw a compliment out to you. I have been reading up on monetary policy. I can sit there and explain to people that we have a debt-based monetary system and all of that, but I think your description of these federal notes being circulating U.S. debt is probably the most precise, succinct way to describe our monetary system, and I want to say that I think that was exceedingly well articulated. And I'm going to steal it from you and use it from this day forward.
Oh, absolutely, do so.
But I'll give you
property rights anyway.
Well, I'll give you credit for it, but I think that is the best explanation I have ever heard. Even though I understood it, I suddenly realized, we can really, because when you get into trying to, I remember the fella cutting my hair. Mm-hmm. And usually when people start asking me stuff now, I tell them, hey, I'm off the air. I really don't want to talk about this. But, the guy's sitting there cutting my hair. So I delve into the whole thing, and you can see their eyes start glassing over. And then when you tell them, well, pull one out, look at it, Federal Reserve note, this is nothing but circulating U.S. debt. I think that is excellent explanation.
Well, thanks. It helps that I live in England where the money actually says that. I promise to pay. It's a promissory note.
Well, very well put. Now, you note in your book that we here in America have historically been the country least sympathetic to debtors. Could you elaborate on that one?
That's really interesting because, it's a kind of a paradox because, so many of the settlers were fleeing their debts. They were debtors, absconded debtors in many cases.
Well, here, the whole colony of Georgia was a debtor. It was founded by the debtors' prisoners.
And you got to figure who's the people most likely to want to leave their country and go to entirely new land, sort of like Mr. Micawber and Dickens. You can just run away. And so, on the other hand, they proved extremely unsympathetic to people who got in debt again. Maybe there's this idea of you came here, you have a new chance, you can start over. Now you have no excuse. But the Constitution actually specifically says in it that Congress should pass a bankruptcy law, and it took about 100 years for them to actually permanently put one in place because everybody kept objecting on moral grounds.
Well, David, let me ask you this. Since you have articulated so well the circulating notion of U.S. debt, can we delve into the fact that if we paid off the debt, we would have no money?
Yep, exactly.
Well, would you elaborate as succinctly as possible to the listeners what that concept is all about?
If money is credit, if money is basically an IOU, since it's no longer attached to gold or anything concrete like that, well, it's IOU by whom? It's true that banks make up money, too. Federal Reserve is actually just a consortium, a combination of private banks, which is given a sort of semi-official function. But banks make up money. Owing to the fractional reserve system, which has been changed and made much more generous. But they have to have a certain amount of reserves. But for every dollar, I think, 16 now they can actually lend? Yeah, they've gotten rid of it entirely in some countries like Australia. But yes, so they're actually allowed to lend more than they actually have. So again, banks can just make up money as well. However, if the federal government didn't run a deficit and all that money wasn't flowing out of the Federal Reserve as a result, banks would have to create all of the money, which is exactly the thing that they're not doing because they're very, very reluctant to lend right now. So the idea of balancing the budget at this point probably would be actually a negative economically, and getting rid of the deficit entirely would be a disaster.
Because we would have no money.
Exactly.
All right. Now, last night I was listening to a couple of non-economics types that were just blasting the gold standard, saying that it would not provide the liquidity and if the economy expanded. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, actually just things would get cheaper and cheaper, as they did during the 136 years period where we did not have this current rendition of a central bank. What is your thought on returning to some form of gold or silver standard?
I think historically it's extremely unlikely. One of the things that I noticed is that history, there's actually kind of a shape to it. If you look at, there's an alternation between periods where credit money is dominant and everybody kind of understands that money is an IOU. It's just a promise, just like any other promise. It's just a promise that you can attach numbers to. Now, that's true in ancient Mesopotamia. It goes away, and for about 1,000 years, starting around the period of ancient Greece, where in China, India, in Greece, they invent coinage pretty much simultaneously. So you have a long period of about 1,000 years where everybody's using cash. Middle Ages, it goes back to credit again. You have this idea that they reverted to barter in the Middle Ages. It's not true at all. They had credit systems. Then, after 1492, the bullion comes into the Americas. We go back to gold and silver, and that's a period that seems to have ended in 1971, more or less. You have rapid invention of credit cards, financial capital. Most money floating around is now in speculation rather than an actual investment. You have all of these changes, which are similarly in the direction of credit money. And I don't think that can be really reversed. I think instead we need to embrace it and see what's happened in the past in periods where credit money predominates, which is, generally speaking, that people have had to create some kind of institution to protect debtors. Now, that's what happened in Mesopotamia with the clean slates, biblical jubilees. Every 7 years you wipe debts clean. But also in the Middle Ages, they had anti-usury laws, so they created interest-free forms of economics, which worked well enough. Actually, they worked extremely well in the Islamic world, which was perhaps the most economically prosperous in history up to that time. And it ran on interest-free credit systems. Now, the thing is, this time around, it seems like they did exactly the opposite. They created all these institutions like the IMF, things like the S&P are in there too, which basically act to make sure, instead of protecting debtors against creditors, protect creditors against debtors. And that's one reason you see this terrible polarization of wealth and increasing social instability across the world. It's not a viable system. So I think that it's not the credit money that's a problem. It's the fact that we haven't created the system right. We haven't followed historical precedent.
Well, David, we're going to have to leave it right there. But before we hop out, tell our listeners real quick how they can find your book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years.
It should be available in any bookstore. I certainly hope so. It's also available on Amazon, and you can get it direct from Melville House, the publisher.
David, we'd love to have you on again, buddy.
Oh, really? Okay, you like that? Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, we'll call you again. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.